Hello everyone, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And also on that note, welcome back to the 4th episode of I Watched It So That You Didn't Have to, Queen Njinga, the 4th episode of the African Queen series created by Jada Pinkett Smith that has been exceptionally interesting here for the past several weeks covering. While there are many more that I'm sure that are going to end up being created, this entire thing has been a massive controversy for Netflix, and I know why. After first doing the whole thing with Cleopatra, and now with Queen Njinga, it's quite a bit of a mess, and there's so much information that is blatant misinformation or is just outright left out to be a lie by omission, and we're going to be going into a lot of that here today, because I thought that the 3rd episode was bad. My god, the 4th episode just gets even worse. Anyway, I've talked too much, let's go ahead and get into this thing. As we covered in the previous episode, Queen Njinga has taken over the kingdom of Matamba, and from that she's using it as a power base in the 1630s in order to be able to raid the Portuguese and keep a continuous type of harassment up against them, which from the beginning it shows one of those harassment cases here with a little bit of a raid, and then it has to start with a cringy line by Jada that says the slave trade is bleeding West Central Africa dry. The implications of what they're going to be talking about this, as they have for the entire series so far, is that it's entirely on the Europeans and completely neglecting to talk about any of the stuff that Njinga was doing to expand the slave trade, because it was how she was financing her kingdom. But don't worry, we're going to get into that. It's just a really bad line to start things out from the beginning, because technically speaking, it is true. It's just framed in the worst way possible. Oh yeah. And then what it shows here for the raid that happens immediately after, with her forces running in like this slow little jog. It's not even a sprint in to take out. Like this whole combat sequence with her, even it's just awful. Like these guys don't hear her coming when they're like, oh, no, like they're like ululating. Wait, is that the right term? Ululating? Yeah. And they're just like doing this little slow jog into the battlefield. It looks awful. The combat in this series is just terrible. Like, oh my god, wow, such an amazing battle that you see here. But either way, moving on, she did actually raid the Portuguese continuously over this time period, cutting them off from the slave trade in an effort to deprive them of that income. And she did this for years to weaken them, until it moves to the point that as queen, the Portuguese are sending people to specifically negotiate with her. One of the things that they do as a sign of goodwill for it is they release her sister, Kambu. But then the entire line of dialogue that they have between them over this is so incredibly cringy and stupid, because it neglects to say, oh yeah, no, the Portuguese are just trying to get peace with her. No, she was making overtures of peace with them the entire time as well. There were tentative peace talks that were going on during this entire period. But no, it has to give this really big dramatic moment where she gets her sister and she looks back at the Portuguese man who's accompanying her and says, they sent him with me with a message for you. I've given your sister back. Now open up your slave markets. To which she stands up all slow and angry and proceeds to angrily threaten the envoy, saying that they still have her sister and that there will be no peace. It's just a thing that is put in here in the first place to make her look stronger, but it doesn't show any of the complexity of what was going on, because she was sending diplomats trying to secure peace with the Portuguese as well. It wasn't just this one-sided thing of them trying to make peace with her. Followed by the line, there will be no slave markets, completely neglecting the fact that, again, she already has slave markets, and that's how she's financing her war with the Portuguese, is by selling people into slavery so that she can then use the money to get weapons in order to fight them. Bad dialogue, Netflix. But anyway, she gets her sister back, it moves on to the title sequence, and then it skips ahead to 1641, a full 8 years ahead in the span of like 30 seconds. What the absolute hell? It doesn't talk about any of the stuff that was going on during this time, just the fact that she had been raiding the Portuguese and making life difficult for them, which is true, and it does mention how her other sister Fungi, is being kept inside of Fort Masango, where she is a valuable asset because she's been acting as a kind of spy for her sister, and this has given her valuable information to be able to fight the Portuguese and target them as they would try and launch raids into the countryside. But it completely skips over and neglects all the stuff that was happening with her domestically and also foreign policy wise that is really important to understand as to what kind of position she was actually in. What Netflix completely skips, going from 1633 all the way until 1641, is the sheer amount of conquest and fighting that she was doing and expanding the slave trade in her region in order to be able to finance all of her different conflicts. With Matamba under her control, she worked extensively to expand this trade because it was going to be the backbone of her entire economy. Over the course of that decade, she and the Portuguese would continuously struggle in the region, trying to take control of key trade routes in order to be able to block each other out, because they were competing over the exact same kind of lanes. In capturing parts of the Congo River, that meant that she was able to cut off African kingdoms that were deeper inside of Africa from being able to trade with the Portuguese easily. She brought the key slave trading regions under her direct control so that she would be able to operate and control them. In having a monopoly over this trade, she would be able to determine determine the prices, and she would be able to cut off the Portuguese from something that was giving them a ton of money at this time. Also, as she moved further north, she was establishing trade relations with the Dutch and trading them anywhere between like 10 to 15,000 slaves per year. But they don't talk about any of this. No, instead it just depicts her as this anti-slavery crusader that is constantly fighting and not negotiating. She won't give up. They don't mention the fact that she would continue to send peace overtures to the Portuguese during this entire period, and even suggested to them to make an alliance with them, but only if they supported her returning to Ndongo and recognizing her as the female king. But no, they're just simplifying her character to show her as a fighter, and that's it. Anyway, we skip ahead to the point past her sister being a spy, to the Dutch actually sending over a negotiation team in order to negotiate an alliance. And it talks about how all of the varying powers want in on the slave trade, including the Dutch, but the way that it frames this entire thing for the negotiation is awful. Like, all of her people are super against it because it's just more slavers. And then the Portuguese come in, or not the Portuguese, the Dutch, and it's all these frumpy looking guys, and they act kind of subservient and like, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, well, we could kind of do this. I don't know. And I'm saying that in a very sarcastic voice because I can't actually play the dialogue for you here, because if you see it and you hear their voices, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, but I don't want this video to be taken down by Netflix. But over the course of the entire negotiations, it makes the Dutch look so incredibly weak and subservient for some reason. And at 9 minutes, there's this entire line that says, oh, this land has never known peace and friendship because of the Portuguese. No, they were infighting and fighting with each other a lot before then. It's just more cringy dialogue that is being put in by Netflix to make the Portuguese look worse than they were. We are a people running from extinction. Again, it keeps on framing this in such a way that it's like slavery is the great evil that they're fighting against, and it's not true. And so the Dutch are like, oh, well, I mean, we could help you, but I mean, we don't know. Something like this is kind of unprecedented. I don't know what could happen. We could provide you soldiers and weapons, but we would need to expand key trade goods. And it's like skirting around the subject, with the Dutch being kind of afraid of angering her by not wanting to use the word slaves. And she's going in and needling them about this whole thing with slavery, acting the entire time like she's super against it, when it's not true. This is not how the negotiations went at all. It's being falsely framed to put her in an even greater position of power. And also from it seems to be implying that it's like the Dutch were coming to her when it was the other way around. See, here's what happened, and Netflix just completely skips all of the context before this previously. So what had occurred was that in 1641, forces from the Dutch West India Company that were working in an alliance already with the Kingdom of the Congo to the north, they had moved in and seized Luanda, as it talks about, which had driven the Portuguese out and allowed the Dutch to set up their own base. Njinga knew that this was a big deal, and so she had sent a team to negotiate with the Dutch in order to secure an alliance. But it wasn't just an alliance with the Dutch, it was also with the Congo and the other forces that they were working with from different kingdoms in a kind of big Afro-Dutch alliance. A coalition, if you will. She had immediately requested an alliance and offered to open up the slave trade to them. This whole thing about them having to debate whether to open it up, and like the Dutch kind of having to skirt around the subject with her as though it's a sensitive topic, is complete bullshit. It also doesn't talk about how the big thing that she was worried about from this and why she wanted in on it is that she wanted to be able to secure stuff for an alliance because she worried that the people of the Congo were going to become too powerful working with the Dutch, and she wanted to counterbalance them. That was like one of her big worries, was that the Congo was going to expand too quickly because they were her rivals as well. So this whole exchange is a giant load of crap. The Dutch very quickly accepted her offer that she gave them and then sent down their own ambassadors and soldiers to assist her. Terrible framing. Absolutely terrible. Anyway, at least one of the things that it talks about that is good is like a difference between the Portuguese and the Dutch is that it does specifically mention that the Portuguese were there to conquer while the Dutch were there only for trade. They did not want to take over Ndongo, which is one of the reasons why she was so much more willing to work with the Dutch versus the Portuguese, because they were less of a threat. Which then brings us after the negotiation to this whole interaction with her sister, and her family is like shocked and berating her and talking about like the evils that they have seen, entire villages wiped out, and how they're just working with more slavers and they can't do this. And this whole interaction with her sister over slavery and how she's doing what she has to do is complete bullshit. It's made up dialogue, it's cringy, and it's ahistorical. It does not show the actual complexity of what was going on, and it's completely misframing how she operated her kingdom in the first place. Oh, and there's another little detail about this that just completely breaks everything that they're trying to talk about with the story. It's awful. And that is when they talk about the impact that they are having on the slave trade through all of their raids, it specifically mentions that at At the peak of the slave trade, the Portuguese from this region had been exporting around 10,000 to 13,000 enslaved individuals annually. But because of Njinga, it dropped to almost zero. Yeah, but then it doesn't talk about how she sent approximately 10 to 13,000 people annually to the Dutch. The problem was never that she was against slavery, it was that she was against the Portuguese having control of the slave trade that made her all of that money. She was perfectly willing to sell people to the Dutch. That was something that made her money and it helped her secure power. Simply awful framing, Netflix. You cut out so much of the information. Anyway, it skips over to the year 1646 and it talks about how there's a new governor that has come in from the Portuguese in order to try and fight them. I want to say that I don't know why they're skipping all of this information of what is going on here, but I fully know why. Everything that I've talked about with you all previously here over the past several minutes is all details that Netflix is not telling you. They are lying by omission in order to not reveal it because it just complicates her character further. So it skips all of the actions that she has been doing over the past several years. And you're going to say, oh, complicate her character? Well, what do you mean, Stack? Well, let me explain. The fact is that using the large size of her army and her new wealth and her reputation, which was a very fierce one, mind you, Njinga over the course of 1641 all the way till 1644 had been able to reclaim large parts of Ndongo. But she wasn't just fighting to reclaim her homeland, she was also simultaneously invading other territories around her in order to secure more slaves to sell that she could then use for more weapons and for her own finances. As an example, one of the things that she had done was that she invaded the Wandu region, which was part of the Congo, but it was currently in revolt against the king. And although these lands had never actually been part of the kingdom of Ndongo, she refused to give them back, which really offended the king of Congo, Garcia II. But no, they don't mention the Congo over the course of the entire thing. They don't talk about the Grand Alliance that they had. No. It's only the Dutch and Njinga. That's it. They're the only ones that are fighting. And eventually, when you see the Dutch leave, it's only Njinga. But also, I can probably guess that the reason that they skipped that whole thing about her conquest and invasion of an allied territory is because they didn't want to complicate her character further. Like when she had done this whole thing, the Dutch, who were still hoping that they could preserve their alliance with both the Congo and also Ndongo, they brokered a peace deal between the two powers, but things were still really strained. Oh, and also remember the Imangala warriors and Kasanje, her husband? Yeah, they don't talk about them for the entire episode, even though for the past several episodes, it's been a really big deal that the Imangala were working with them, and there's a very key reason as to why that Netflix skips. And that is that Kasanje, fearing her power, ended up creating a coalition of other Imangala leaders and actually attacking her. He betrayed her. He invaded her lands through Matamba, but they never actually really made much progress. She was able to fight them off and hold them back. But Netflix can't show this because it could never show any of the complexity of politics that was happening in the region, and it also can't show her girl boss character being betrayed by other African people there, which is simply awful because it does not show then how powerful she was to be able to resist this in the first place. She's just the hero that everyone is rallying behind. And because she was able to win battles, she was able to win the support of her people, and with more nobles flocking to her side, this meant that she was receiving more tribute in slaves from these nobles that she could then sell to the Dutch to get more weapons, as I've already said multiple times. But it can't talk about it because then that potentially makes her look bad. Anyway, I've gone on enough of a rant. It moves on to a battle here with the Portuguese, but this is simply awful choreography that makes no sense. You can never tell what's happening in any of these battles because the numbers are so tiny and there's such a mismatch melee that you have no idea what's going on. So like, honestly, I'm surprised that they could even tell that she's losing. But either way, it doesn't matter. They lose the battle, her sister gets recaptured, and they discover from all of this that her sister was a spy, and they reportedly end up executing her by drowning. What they show in this is very true. And then it shows this whole scene where she's negotiating with the Dutch for more support, for more soldiers, more guns, more everything. And this entire scene of negotiation is incredibly stupid because it shows the Dutch going to her and saying, oh, hey, in order to get more help, we're going to need more slaves. And she acts all offended, like, more slaves? You want more slaves? And it's incredibly stupid and wrong. That did not happen. It shows Njinga acting like she is against slavery and against all of this, but as we've covered multiple times already, she's not. It's just more false framing. She doesn't begrudgingly accept the Dutch proposal in order to get what she wants. No, she's like, okay, well, we're just upping the amount of slaves that we're trading because it's increasing further support, and she was ready to do this at any given time. So yeah, Netflix shows how she increased the slave trade with the Dutch in order to get what she wants, but because this is now a bad image that it doesn't want to show her in that particular way, they then followed up with lines such as, how do you protect people in an era of omnipresent slavery? They're making all of these excuses now going into it like, oh no, she's doing only what she has to. She's still fighting this fight, and they're framing it in such a way, again, that she is against slavery. But now they're kind of having to backtrack because they're forced to show at least a couple of the things that she is doing, which really does complicate her character. But again, they continuously frame it over the course of this entire thing as though it's an anti-slavery crusade, and that's not true. Like, seriously, it includes lines such as, the price for recognition will be high. How high? We want more slaves. One of her warriors then responds, oh, what did I tell you? Snakes, all of them. They only want slaves. Like, yeah, no, you all knew that from the very beginning. And then she says, quote, you have already taken countless numbers of my people. Lady, you haven't been defending them in the first place. You've been selling them into slavery already, and you've been continuously waging wars in order to get more slaves to sell. Like, this dialogue, these lines, these circumstances, the negotiations, everything from how they're framing it makes zero sense whatsoever. And I know that I'm repeating myself. I know that I am. But it continuously puts in these same kind of lines with the same situations that are all false. And it pisses me off to high hell. Anyway, she gets the support that she wanted in the first place. They're moving on. They're going in order to try and siege Fort... what was it called? Masanango? Yeah, Masangano. Oh, sorry, that was the name. Masangano. They're going to siege down the fort. And then while they've been laying siege to it, she receives a message saying that the Dutch soldiers have been called back to Luanda because it is currently under attack by the Portuguese and they need more support. So after a very tearful exchange with this individual that I can't remember the name of what was going on, she finally agrees to send her forces back in order to be able to help the Dutch, only to arrive a little bit too late, and the Portuguese have retaken the settlement and the Dutch have agreed to leave Africa there. And of course, she's very angry that she lost Dutch support, but once again, Netflix completely skips the context of everything that had happened. Because back when she was laying siege to the fort, the issue was that they didn't have artillery to actually take the fort in the first place. And so because they couldn't do that, they were laying siege and implying the entire time over the course of this episode that, oh, they were one day away from taking it and then they got called back. They were this close to victory, but that's not true. They didn't have artillery, so they were just biding their time. They weren't a day away. That's bullshit. And then in August of 1648, a Portuguese expedition had arrived at Luanda and laid siege to it. And after suffering from bombardment, because mind you, a fleet of ships had shown up and were bombarding the thing, the Dutch commander then sued for peace and agreed to evacuate the region. Like, it's way more complex than what they're showing, and it's a lot more severe, but it doesn't tell what actually happened. And so now faced with the fact that there was a fully stocked garrison, so Njinga and her forces are forced to retreat back to Matamba, but they would continue to fight the Portuguese. And then the next scene that it has is one of her men bringing in a captured priest, Zelotes, the guy who baptized her. Zelotes tells her how she needs to adopt Christianity, how she needs to get support from the Pope, and how she needs to start converting her population, which is kind of true, and she would follow through with this. See, throughout the 1640s and 1650s, what would happen with Njinga is that she would gradually begin to adopt Christian cultural traditions effectively. So over the course of the 1650s, what she had done was sent out Capuchin missionaries to interact with different European courts and try and garner support, and also to interact with the Pope as much as possible, writing letters, which they do talk about that she would do. She would really try to secure support from the Pope. All true. And it keeps on giving this whole idea over the course of this that she's hesitant to leave the old ways of her people, but it's not really true. Because Njinga was very ready at any given time to use Christianity as a tool, even adopting a lot of it within her own court. From the 1650s moving onward, she would continuously rely on Christian missionaries and other forces within her court in order to be able to shore up her own power. She would create an entire new class of Christian lords, counselors, and other people that were specifically loyal to her in comparison to the old traditionalists of her extended family. She was smart in how she did it, and it doesn't really go into all that, but that's a real facet of this history. But either way, now it skips to 1654, and it doesn't mention that in the previous years after 1648 that her war against the Portuguese with her allies would continue. Because what Njinga had done during this time was create an entire alliance of different African kingdoms and had expanded her influence around it as she aged. She would even send out soldiers to enforce her rule and decrees upon local noblemen. And she would even fight more against the Imangala. She would fight against other kingdoms. She would continuously be expanding her power and rule. But it doesn't touch upon that because no, it's only showing her being against the Portuguese and not the complex politics of the region. Well, either way, the next thing that happens is that the Portuguese send over a priest in order to negotiate with her, and this entire interaction is incredibly cringy and bullshit. It has the Portuguese offering a series of demands of her, including providing 200 slaves. in order to be a ransom for her sister, which she does refuse. But the dialogue in here is incredibly cringy, as it just has the priest frame it as like, oh, we demand that you cease your warlike practices and then also give us 200 slaves. And it has her give this whole lecture about how they must surrender themselves apparently to some god whose name that they're not able to pronounce. And these threats against their traditional way of life, but it's all bullshit and it doesn't make sense because by this point, Njinga had already reconverted to Christianity. It was one of the things that was done specifically in order to aid negotiations like this in the first place. The thing is, she does refuse to pay the ransom for her sister. That is something that she does. But it does not talk about or address how she would use Christianity as a tool, as I had just previously explained. This entire thing of how they phrase it is some big show of force that it's like, no, she's refusing the Portuguese demands. She's standing up and is strong to them. But that's not what happened. Like, there is a line in here where she says, just so I'm clear, you are asking for us to turn our back on our ancestors, throw away our culture, what we have known since birth, like framing it in such a way as though she's offended and confused by all this when it's not what was happening. But this is going to be really ironic in a second here because I will explain as to why that's so bad. No, she stands up to them and says, we have given enough, and it just stops and ends there. The negotiations are over. But no, it skips to a scene where Njinga is waiting in a war camp and she is given back her sister and everyone is happy and everyone is crying in joy, but it completely skips that negotiations actually ended and that she had agreed to a number of the Portuguese demands, but it can't show that because then it positions her as weak. See, here's the real history of what happened. Under the terms of the peace treaty that they signed, Njinga agreed to cede lands on her kingdom's western coast of Portugal, with the Lucala River becoming the new border between Portuguese Angola and Matamba. In return for this, Portugal would cede some land to her and simultaneously recognize her as the female king. Njinga at the same time also allowed the Portuguese access to the slave markets that she herself was running, and they even agreed to concentrate the slave markets inside of her capital city, which would effectively give her a monopoly on the slave trade. But it doesn't address any of that because it cannot show how she was not only complicit, but had expanded and was in control of the slave trade that she was trading slaves to the Europeans. That's what I'm trying to say. The Portuguese would also send a permanent representative to her court, and she would agree to provide military assistance to the Portuguese whenever they needed it. Also, while simultaneously allowing missionaries inside of her kingdom to convert the population. And they also had to give Portugal slaves every single year as a kind of tribute. They just skip all of that. And they can't show it because this was supposed to be her big victorious moment where she gets her sister back and doesn't show any of the crap that she had to do in order to make that happen. Like, yay, sure, everyone is celebrating, and then she begins to talk to her sister about the complexity of what it is that she had to do without actually naming any of the things that she had to do, and how it's important that she's not going to be around forever and that her sister is going to be taking over, until she finally then gets a letter acknowledging her as a African Christian ruler by the Pope, and everyone celebrates. But oh my God, Netflix, the entire talk about the slave trade during this entire time, and what she had to do without actually naming what she had to. This is so bad because it skips all of her involvement in it. It skips her complexity. It does not go into how ingenious she was, how politically savvy she was, how brutal she was to accomplish what she needed. And they say by the time Njinga is at the end of her life, the slave trade has exploded. That there is basically no country who is not involved in the slave trade. Yeah, that was how it already kind of was. The ones who were not really involved in the trade before were the European powers that weren't there yet, but would also ingrate themselves into a system that already existed. Did I say ingrate? I meant integrate. Talking about plundering the African continents, like the way that it's phrasing things in here is so incredibly bad, and there's no shred of nuance in any of this. They're now making excuses for her after framing her as an anti-slavery crusader by saying that she can't fight against this. She can't fight against all the powers that want to use slavery. What, you mean like herself? This is incredibly disingenuous and dishonest, Netflix. It talks about her sacrificing things, but then it again does not address any of the stuff that she actually did. And it says this line at the end that she managed to secure independence for her kingdom while the rest of Africa was swallowed up by imperialism. And I don't know why that they're framing that, because it wasn't even imperialism at this time necessarily. Like, the imperial era had not begun yet. Africa wouldn't be swallowed up by imperialism for almost 200 more years, so this is just weird framing. But that is where they go and end the story. Like, they briefly mention here at the very end that Ndongo would, after her death, eventually fall to the Portuguese and become known as the region of Angola. It doesn't talk about any of the things that she was doing here at the time or how she managed to secure her kingdom. it doesn't leave us with any reality of her more complex legacy. Instead, it just leaves her as this anti-slavery hero. And I know it's probably frustrating for a number of you listening to this because I've repeated that same line again and again, but each time they say it or phrase things in a specific way that implies that, it pisses me off, and it does that more times than I think that I'm capable of counting. Because here in the end, let me tell you another thing that they skipped that is another aspect of her more complex character, and that is how she used Christianity as a tool. As Njinga aged, she became more and more devoutly Catholic. Whether this was done out of an actual religious belief or whether it was done specifically in order to secure the support of the Portuguese and Europeans, we don't know, but she did. And during that entire time, she was working to convert her people to Christianity, specifically to Catholicism. And this was not something that was not controversial to her population. A lot of the hardcore traditionalists within her society specifically hated her for doing this. She did not have the support of everyone inside of her kingdom. And so religious figures would continuously push back against her in order to try and return to the old ways. And so in response, what Njinga did was that she empowered the Christians within her society and had people go down and burn the traditional temples and shrines of her ancestors and ancient people. Anyone who opposed her would be arrested and either executed, or she would ship them off into slavery. The traditionalists within her court, like the Njinga that had supported her with all the stuff for her ancestors and all of that, yeah, if they opposed her, she had them dismissed from her court and then publicly whipped. Several of the prominent priests that had served with her, if they refused to convert, they were turned around and sold as slaves to the Portuguese. With Njinga personally asking the Portuguese that these slaves be shipped overseas so that they wouldn't be a threat to her kingdom, and then she ended up using the money from the sales in order to build more churches. A number of the priests that she would do this to ended up escaping and would, over the course of the next several years, try to foment rebellion against her, but it doesn't talk about it. She would use Christianity as a tool in order to try and prepare things for her sister, and it doesn't want to go into any of the complexity of her character or the terrible but great things that she would do in order to secure that to make it happen. She developed Matamba as a trading power by capitalizing on a strategic position as a gateway to the rest of Africa and would turn it into a capital of the slave trade. Netflix, you have framed this in a way that is dishonest, it is disingenuous, it infuriates me, and I know that I've repeated myself, and for all of those different times, and to my wife who is probably editing this video, I do apologize to you. I'm now leaving this series just with a feeling of disappointment and anger and even amusement to a degree. Just, I'm amazed that what they had done for the first 2 episodes to show how things were situated, that it could devolve that quickly over the 3rd and 4th episode into something of a power fantasy. A power fantasy that in the end skips over all of the important details that help to make her powerful in the first place. But everyone, that is the end of the African Queens Njinga series. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you all next time. I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe, and also at the same time, let me know in the comment section below what other kinds of series or things that we should analyze next and look at, because there is so many other things that have been created with just bad history. Whether accidental or deliberate, it doesn't really matter. So many terrible things have been created, and I do want to address and talk about a lot of those. Give me your suggestions. Thank you, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.